Ulf?
Yeah, hello. Can you
Yeah.
hear me?
Yes, definitely.
Okay, I try to adjust the screen a bit. Okay,
Good.
very good.
Só um minutinho, tá, Olavo, pra gente começar lá no Facebook. Só um minuto, tá?
So falta minuto ago, yeah. Yeah, we're like a minute away still. We have to.
Okay, so, and I have to find out how to share my screen.
Yes, there should be a green button somewhere.
Yeah, I see this. And this is the... Let's see. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes, that works.
Okay, wonderful. Hopefully the internet will not break down or stop working at all, and then we are good to go from my side.
Yeah, our team is scattered around. Our internet goes down quite frequently, so we just like do it from different places. So that there's always there's going to be somebody along with you. Most of us here are in the initiative team. I have like a couple of participants from outside, and we're now on Facebook as well. So some people watch it over there, and I think I'll just what time is it? Yeah, well, it's 4 o'clock. I think I'll just actually start by making a couple of announcements. So maybe I'll share my screen and and get it over yours.
Okay.
And then and then we can start talking. I'd be very glad to hear about how the project's going. I mean, we're quite curious after.
Yes, very good.
After Hong Kong. Okay, so can you unshare your screen just so I can share mine?
Yeah, I can. Let's see. Yeah, like this?
Yes, that's fine. So, bom dia a todo mundo. Para quem está assistindo por aqui pelo Facebook, welcome everybody. We're the Brazilian Reproducibility Initiative. This is our 6th webinar actually. So we have Dr. Ulf Tölch from Berlin at the Quest Center these days. And we will, I'll just start, well, I mean, we'll pass it over to him quite pretty soon. I'll just start with a couple of announcements here. One is so just share my screen for a minute. And we have a couple of news on the initiative. So if you're a participant with us, you know, we're sending you back the protocols. So we're finally getting over the protocol stage. I think you should, if we owe you a protocol, we should be getting back to you very soon, so we can make final adjustments, register, and have it all ready by the end of the year. We have a couple of general announcements for everybody as well. So first thing is our funder has recently put out an open science practice guideline. We worked quite hard to make this happen actually. So I mean, this is largely our work as well. So if you want to access it, it's available at this link down here. You can just type Serra Pideira, Boas Práticas, Open Science, Ciência Aberta in Google. It should come out. But I think it's like the most progressive set of open science guidelines by a Brazilian funder up to the moment. I think Ulf works a lot in terms of promoting reproducible research. So I guess it goes well with the title of the talk today. And second thing, and this is actually probably the last chance to participate in the Brazilian Reproducibility Initiative. If you do not participate yet, our prediction project is opening very soon. So we should be holding, so this is about predicting the results of replications. So whether scientists can predict whether experiments included in the initiative will be reproduced successfully or not. Anybody with experience in experimental research can participate anywhere in the world. So that goes for you as well, Ulf. You can help us share the work. We should be starting the surveys on mid-November, and we should be holding the prediction markets on December. So in surveys, everybody makes their predictions individually. In the prediction market, people actually bet on what experiments will replicate or not. You get credit, and you try to, I mean, it's kind of like a stock market. You try to make the most of your credits, trying to predict what replicates, what doesn't. Of course, this is only, we're not going to know the results in a year or so, but still, I think it's quite fun to join. I think there's a lot to learn, both from the data we get and from like you trying to replicate to predict whether replication will be successful. I think it's going to be great learning for all of us. And please help us share the word. We have two more weeks of recruitment still. We're very open to anybody who's an adult and has experience in experimental research within an academic environment. So you can find the registration form at your website. You can just leave us your email there. We'll email you with the consent form or with the link to the survey as soon as that's set, and that should be mid-November, more or less. And this is about it. So I'll pass the word to Ulf now. Ulf is at the Quest Center for Transforming Biomedical Research in Berlin at the Charité University Hospital, which is a very active center in terms of promoting reproducible research both locally and globally, hopefully. And he's involved in DECIDE, which is a large-scale replication initiative happening in Germany. It might be like the closest cousin to the Brazilian reproducibility initiative in a particular country. So we're very eager to hear what he has to say and how his project is going. So back to you, Ulf.
Yes, thank you. So thank you, Olavo. So you asked me to do like a talk, like first part and second part. So in the first part, I'll introduce the Quest Center a bit, so that you know a bit about the background, because we're working at like what we do, what the general idea is, how many people we are. This might be interesting for you. And the second part is basically dedicated at this DECIDE project, which will be very interesting for you when you look at this from a reproducibility point of view, because it's a large-scale reproducibility project where we kind of monitor and evaluate reproducibility projects. So let me briefly share the screen with you. It's this one, yes. Let's see. And okay, can you see this? Yes, hopefully. Okay, so in the first part, I want to introduce the Quest Center for Transforming Biomedical Research. And our center is in Berlin, and it's part of the Berlin Institute of Health. And our main focus, our main interest is translational research. That is, how can we bring from basic research and preclinical research anything to the patient? So how can we reach the patient with our research, and how can we improve this process? Because as you may know from the let me see how I can advance this. Here. Okay, so this is our mission. We support PIH researchers and also researchers at the Charité. And you have to know that Charité is the largest university hospital in Europe with approximately 5,000 to 6,000 researchers. So this is really like a large-scale enterprise. And we are at this Berlin Institute of Health catering to the Charité and a very basic biomedical institute, that's the Max Delbrück Center. So they do the basic research, and at Charité we do the applied research to patients and preclinical research. And the Quest mission is to support the PIH researchers because we see that there are problems with this translational process. And it's particularly that if you look at the literature, and I don't have to tell you this because you're all involved in this reproducibility project, that if you look at the literature, there is a major problem, particularly looking at this translational gap. That is the gap between preclinic and clinical research. We have, for example, in Alzheimer's disease, besides pushing millions and millions into preclinical research, we haven't found any cure for Alzheimer's. Or in stroke research, it's very similar. So the treatments that come out of the preclinic are not as promising as they were in the preclinic. So we have, for example, in preclinical research, in stroke research, we have approximately 1,300 treatments that were tested in clinical trials, and only one of them was promising for stroke research. So this apparently is a major problem, and you may think, okay, this is of course a problem because those are diseases that appear in the nervous system, particularly in the central nervous system, and they are complicated diseases. But another thing is, of course, that the quality of the preclinical research is kind of lacking the standards that what we want to have. And this is what you see in this slide, that a lot of funders and also journals see that there's a reproducibility crisis, and it is particularly dire when we talk about patients and patient hopes, and that we are basically doing research that we want to bring to the patients, but that we cannot bring to the patients because it does not survive the early clinical trials and even not late clinical trials. I don't know whether you've heard this, the latest Alzheimer's trials in the US, they failed and they cost pharmaceutical companies millions of dollars in the stock market because their stocks dropped because the drugs did not hold up. And if you look in hindsight then at the preclinical evidence, you see that there are major quality problems with this. Okay, so we're starting from here, and my boss Uli Diernagel, who is the founder of the Quest Center, he's a stroke researcher. And he comes from this perspective that his whole life he has done this whole stroke research, but apparently they couldn't deliver. And he is motivated by this to fund this, this institute. And what our main principle is we want to advance knowledge in a responsible way. That is, we want to make science more trustworthy, that is more robust and rigorous. We want to make it more useful for scientists and more transparent, and also for society more relevant. This is very particularly, if you talk about translational research, this is very important because you have patients for which this will be relevant at a certain point. And we also wanted to make it more ethical for humans and for animals, because there are certain problems in this, particularly regarding ethics, where I will come to later, which is true not only for Germany but for a wide range of countries. And how do we do this? We've identified certain processes. That is, for example, for the trustworthiness, it is very important that we're talking about randomization and blinding. And I think the Brazilian project is also very much about this, that in reproducibility, if you reproduce something, and also critical appraisal of the research, you have to look at whether people are randomizing or blinding. And if we look at stroke research, for example, it's very obvious that people do not report randomization and blinding, and this has a major impact on the effect sizes that they estimate in their studies. So replication is confounded by these factors that people do not randomize and do not blind, because a confirmation bias that researchers may have towards the hypothesis is kicking in, and this leads to an inflation of effect sizes. So we think that informing and enforcing also randomization and blinding in clinical trials will lead to a better understanding and also appraisal of preclinical results. The second point is power, and you certainly have this also discussions in your project. If we go to something like replication and confirmation, as you do, what are good strategies to estimate effect sizes? And from this, and this is what mainly the second part of the talk will be about, what are good strategies to come about with estimation of effect sizes, and from there on estimate and from there on do a replication or confirmation of existing results. And we think that this is very much field dependent, and I'll come this because this is part of the second talk. I'm not going to go into detail here. And we think also that everything has to be useful for scientists, and this is very much geared towards transparency. Research is useful for scientists when it's transparent. If we cannot read the methods part of a paper properly, and if we cannot follow what people are doing in their methods, it's no longer useful for us because we cannot replicate it. And also our appraisal of the research that is presented is not as high as of research which has high transparency. So we aim for fostering pre-registration, particularly when it comes to replication and confirmation. And all researchers at Charité tell us, oh yeah, we are in this basic research field, we only do exploratory research, we don't need pre-registration. And we totally concur with that. If you're doing exploratory research, perhaps you don't need pre-registration, but on the other hand, after exploratory research, you always need some kind of confirmatory replicatory phase. And in this, you need pre-registration to be sure that the results from this pre-registration phase or from the confirmatory phase really rest on a sound basis and are conducted as you've done. I'm going to talk a bit about timely reporting of results later on, why this is important in clinical trials. And we're supporting open data with policy changes at the Charité and also open access, but this is kind of, I don't know how it's in Brazil, but currently we acquired funding to allow Charité researchers to publish basically everything open access that they want. And in our clinical research, it's of course important to always think about patients and the relevancy for our research for patients. So we're advocating patient-orientedness, which is perhaps not so important in your setting, but in our setting, it's very important that scientists in preclinical and clinical research are very much focused on the priority setting of their research. So sometimes there's a mismatch between the two. If you study a certain disease, the needs of the patients are sometimes differently from what you research actually. And we are also looking at ethical at the ethical perspective for humans. So is it possible to do risk-benefit analysis properly, and how is informed consent for the patients done, and also data protection? It's not so much focus for what you do, so I'm going to skip this a bit. But for animals, we're looking at the 3 R's, at the you heard this talk by Natalie, I think, like last week. Olavo? Yeah, exactly. And she talked a lot, I think, about the 3 R's, so I'm going to skip this here as well. Okay, how do we do this? So we have a couple of approaches that we use. Of course, first of all, we have education. That is basically one of my main tasks, to do education and come up with education programs and think about what kind of education programs can we have. We also have, if you look at our webpage, we have a couple of how-to tools, so some apps that we have, and where you can, for example, publish your data or learn about how to publish your data without having a full-fledged review process behind it, but what kind of alternative methods there are. Then one important bit, I don't know whether you have this in your projects, is that we advocate the electronic lab notebooks. That is getting away from the paper lab notebooks, because they are not auditable, not searchable, and all kinds of stuff can happen to a paper notebook. And we try to roll this out throughout the Charité. So 5,000. We hope at some point that 5,000 researchers will just say, yes, the electronic lab notebook is a good idea. We do consultation. We award people for following a couple of our recommendations. I'm coming to this in a second. And we also offer support for them, for example, in how they can open up their data. And we support them in patient engagement. This is a pretty new project that we have. Patient engagement and support in hiring and performance-oriented funding. I'm also coming to this. And on top of this, we have meta-research and bioethics. So we have a chair for bioethics in our department, and we also conducting meta-research. So research on research with a couple of people. Just to give you a general estimate, so we have 7 full-time employed people on this, plus my boss, Uli. He's a full professor at the Charité, plus the bioethics group by Daniel Strech, who is also a professor and who also has 5 to 6 people working on his projects, not fully employed, not on permanent contracts, but the rest of the Quest team is on permanent contracts. So this is something that will happen for the next couple of years, or tens of years to come. And we also have a very active meta-research community, which I'll present you in a second. Okay. So this is what we do at the Quest. We have a couple of approaches. I covered them all. And just one example is, for example, the electronic lab notebook that we want to roll out at the Charité. And currently we have approximately 1,500 users, 1,600 users. And we support this onboarding by an evaluation and by training researchers. And even though we put a lot of money and a lot of manpower into this, the uptake is good, but still not good enough. So it's not like everybody's on board yet. So it's not like it's a full success story, but already a very good success story, I guess. Then we have education, and I'm only going to present one of these. So we have recurring every year, for example, the Berlin-Oxford Summer School together with the University of Oxford. So if any of your PhD students wants to apply, well, we're happy to have your applications for next year. It will be in Berlin next year, also, I guess, in September. And we always have some kind of travel grants. They will not cover all the costs, but quite a substantial amount of costs. And we're happy to take applications from PhD students and postdocs to this summer school. So if you want to apply to coming there and learn more about open research practices, which go beyond what is usually covered in basic courses, you're happily invited to come to Berlin next year. And I'll give you now 2 or 3 examples, well, major examples, what we've accomplished so far at the BIH towards increased transparency and incentives. One of this is the so-called OutPub project that we have. We scan the whole literature of the Charité for open data, because we believe that open data is one of the keys for researchers to come to a better understanding, A, of the paper, and B, to reuse this data. So we are scanning all the literature of the Charité, identify papers, and what we do is we give additional money to the labs who have this open data. So there's actual research money associated with it. I think currently it's 1,000 euros per paper that people will receive for opening up the data. This will in the future be certainly a bit less, but in the beginning you have to give a bit more to incentivize this. But this is something that we do for every paper at the Charité, and there are many papers that have this, and they all earn this additional money just to incentivize that people go for this extra mile to open up the data. And a further part of our policy making is, so what you see here is the application portal for professors. And if you want to apply at the Charité, you get questions in this portal like, how far have you pursued these open science goals so far? So the Charité is putting great importance to transparent replicable research. And the question now, how is the uptick in the commissions? So it's not up to the Quest Center to decide whether somebody is appointed to a professor, but we have a person, Miriam, a colleague of mine, she's sitting on these committees, and she's observing and also advising these committees towards open and replicable research practices. And we are not sure whether every committee will do this, of course, and committees in biomedical science are difficult, there are political issues, but at least we can now observe and learn from this process what has to be done so that candidates who have open and transparent research practices will be more successful in these, in applying to the Charité. So, and a last example that I want to give you is from our meta research. So we have John Ioannidis sitting where every once in a while with us. So he's Einstein professor in Berlin now for the next 3 to 4 years. And he has a little team. So he's doing meta research. So he's he and his team look at what can we do, particularly in biomedical sciences. Sophia, this PhD candidate, she's particularly looking at incentive structures. So we have a whole research project on these issues. And what's very near and dear to our heart is, of course, what is happening to the patients and the bioethics people, for example, to look at timely reporting of clinical results, very similar to what Ben Goldacre does in Oxford. So we are trying to push the publication of clinical trials. For example, you see here in Berlin, after 2 years, the situation doesn't look good for clinical trials. It's only nearly 40% only that are reported. And what we have to push from an ethical point of view is that 80 to 100% of those clinical trials will be reported. Same, of course, for preclinical trials, but the ethical impact of the clinical trials is much higher. And we think that these are things that definitely need to change. Okay. And I think with this, my ending slide will just show what the Quest Center wants to do. We want to change behavior at the Charité towards those reproducible research practices, towards transparency, by enabling, by giving the capability to do this, by motivating people through incentives and awards, and for also giving them the opportunity to use the tools and resources that we provide. And we're doing this by evaluating this via meta research and translational bioethics. So this is kind of giving you the approximate framework that we work in. And in the second part, after the first round of questions, I will go a bit more into detail into one project that I'm leading beginning next year, where we'll look at reproducibility, particularly in preclinical research. So, and now it's open for questions after advertising the Reward Equator Conference, where apparently some of you will attend, hopefully.
Yes, I'll miss that one. I have a small kid coming, but Clarissa are you? Yeah, yeah. So
I'm planning to.
She should be representing us.
Clarissa, you will be there. Oh,
yeah,
nice.
I'm planning on going.
Yeah, very good.
Yeah, we might have Pedro Tan as well, who's in Amsterdam. I'm not sure he's coming, but yeah, at least one or two people should.
Okay.
From our side should attend. I have one main question really. So your efforts are really focused at Charité, or are you trying to reach out as well? Because of course, I mean, there's not a Quest center in every hospital or in every university. So I mean, I guess there's a lot of work to be done outside. Are you also looking somewhere else, or?
Yeah. So for example, the last effort that I showed you with the publication of clinical research. This is like a project from the bioethics group, which is kind of Germany-wide and even Europe-wide. We try to get stakeholders. There's this European Hospital Alliance, and there's the German Hospital Alliance, and we try to get stakeholders from all university clinics together, because it doesn't work if we only change it at Charité, but it only works if we change it at every university hospital. And so we try to do this, of course, in a more European context. Some of these things are very Charité focused. For example, the educational formats are focused on Charité, but like this webinar here, we're doing for other people. And I was just recently in Australia, where we did a couple of workshops and talks. And next week I'll be at some other university. That's also fine. But it's basically focused at the Charité, because the Berlin Institute of Health sits at the Charité, and this is where the money comes from. So we have to focus our activities on the Charité, but we're happy to have everybody on board, and we get requests for people who want to join us for European funding and so forth.
That's because, I mean, there's also a question for, I mean, what is the right scope to reach out? It's frequently a question. I mean, we do have like a national team at the moment, like a national project, but it's mostly a replication thing. We haven't been really doing this national education thing. And I think it's like we do a lot of things locally, but again, I think it's finding the right level is not easy. Do we have any more questions? I'm speaking here, but I mean, somebody else.
No questions here.
Not in chat, not in Facebook.
No.
So yeah, so I'll just keep on talking. Sorry. The second thing is the lab notebook. So you have your own version of an. Did you develop your own electronic lab notebook? I mean, that actually interests us, because we're getting to the point where we have the protocols nearly ready for the initiative, and we're getting to the point to decide like how standardized should be the whole laboratory data collection. And in that sense, I mean, that's something that's been on our minds for like the past month, certainly. So they just want to hear your experiences. Did you build your own tool? How is the uptake for that, and how easy do you think is to get like 65 labs to actually use the same tool, or not?
Yeah, so even at Charité, where we give this, so we pay a startup from Berlin, LabFolder it's called, for providing this service. And I have to admit that this is a major part of our budget. So it's not cheap to give out electronic lab books to the whole Charité for free. So, but there are, I think, cheaper versions out there and cheaper possibilities. And the main part, of course, is that we, as Charité, we wanted to have it hosted on premise at the Charité, and this is kind of really costly to do this. And it's also not that we have the uptake of every lab. So some labs say, well, now. We use the paper lab notebook all the time, so we're not skipping this now and go to the electronic lab notebook. So this behavioral change is very, very slow. Even though it's for free, we provide service and everything else, it's a very slow uptake. But well, I would just encourage people, for example, in your project, just try it for this one project. You don't have to do it for every other project, but just for this one project, please try it also to use an electronic lab notebook, because it's so much better. And there are lots of advantages, and it can get you into contact with the people. So there's one dedicated person running this, but there's so many advantages to the electronic lab notebook compared to the paper notebook that it's actually a no-brainer for every lab to use it. And those who use it, and where the PI enforces it, it's a success story.
Yeah, no, I fully agree. Just, I mean, there's, we just don't have this, like, I don't know that many lab notebooks or that many models. So like, we would have to like look at. Yeah,
there's a page on the Harvard Library, I think, has an overview of all the lab notebooks that exist. And they have a table there. What kind of lab notebook fits your purpose? I think it's the Harvard Library. I think if you Google it, and if you can't find it, just send me an email and I'll send it to you. There's an overview of what you can use as a lab notebook and how costly it is.
Yeah, that could be useful. Clarissa, did you?
I just had a follow-up question on this
Yes.
electronic lab notebook uptake. Do the researchers provide a specific reason, or do they justify why they don't want to uptake the new model?
Yeah. So as I said, we have a couple of meta researchers, and there's one person currently. She does nothing else but evaluate why people don't take the lab notebook, and it's a really hard job, because the reasons are diverse. They range from, I don't even have a computer in the lab, I don't have wireless in the lab, to my PI just doesn't want me to use it, because we have paper notebooks all the time. So it's really a diverse range of reasons, and young people are very easy to pick this up, because it just comes naturally to them. But like older PIs, they're really against this, because they are used to go into the lab and look at the paper notebook. And but if you're really interested in this evaluation, I can also put you into contact with Christiane, who's the evaluation officer for the electronic lab notebook. And as I said, we're not only working for the Charité, but if you're interested in these experiences, they can certainly give you a summary. So just write me an email what your particular question is, and I'll forward it to Christiane, and she'll certainly answer you.
Sure, thank you.
Do you have any more questions?
If I can ask another.
I have another one, but go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned there are financial incentives for the researchers to adhere to open science practices.
Yes.
How is this going? Is this working, or are there anyone still who doesn't gather their data open?
Yeah. So I forgot to.
If I can add a question, what do you consider open data exactly? I mean, do you have like meet minimal standards, or like fair requirements? Like, I mean, does an Excel table with no annotation work? I mean, where do you draw the line?
Yeah. So so I have to say the Quest Center is only 2 years old. So what we did is, when we started, we kind of recorded the status quo, how many open data publications there are at the Charité. And what we're currently monitoring, how is the increase in open data publications, and then also evaluate, this is again, this one person who also does the electronic lab notebook evaluate why people pick this up and whether the incentives were successful. And for now, and we started with a small award. So we awarded people for opening up the data. And now we coupled this to the performance-oriented funding. So this is a very official version. So every lab gets it, this performance-oriented funding, depending on whether they have open data or not. Before they had to apply, now everybody gets it automatically. And we currently have very liberal standards. regarding open data, even a supplement in a paper as a PDF currently will suffice. But in the next step, we'll refine this and make this more and more difficult. Because if already at the beginning, the stakes are too high for the researchers, we thought that nobody will pick this up. And we currently want people, oh, okay, this is nice money. We want the money and we want the money to flow. So in the future, we'll, of course, the goal is to have fair data. But this is like a process that we have to take towards fair data. In some, for example, in genomics, this is really, really easy to achieve this. Whereas, for example, in functional magnetic resonance imaging, this is slightly more difficult to achieve this. And in some other areas, preclinical areas, this is also more difficult, as there are no coherent nomenclature for certain things that they're currently testing, and there are no standards in the field. So this is very, very, very difficult. So currently the stakes are not so high. Excel files will be sufficient even with the main results and not all the data, but we have a plan how to kind of refine this process.
Any more questions? Either on chat or no? Okay. If I can add a final one, you mentioned that you have people sitting in like hiring committees. Like how is the response to that? I mean, because, I mean, I could see that people could look at you as some kind of like adversarial person there. Like, why are you meddling with my selection process? I mean, that sounds politically challenging. I mean, how has that been viewed by the committees you sit on? Or
So one of the things that Miriam does so there's of course again a process. Like with the open data, we are aware that even the opening up data and everything else, it's all a political process. So what we want to do is to turn this into win-win situation for everyone. And we're doing this by Miriam sits on these committees, and in the first year she only listens. So she's rarely giving comments, just to get into this habit and people getting used to her sitting there. And we know that this is a very, very long-term process. And luckily, our institute, it's not like we are sitting on a grant, but it's a permanent institute. So we can afford to have like a more bit of a long breath in these processes. And at the same time, one must say, it's not easy for Miriam to sit there on these committees. And she can also get psychological counseling because it's sometimes a very aggressive situations can occur. And this is really the hardest part. This is the policy, changing policies and changing committees, and in these high stakes decisions, who's going to get a chair for a new position. And these are really the high challenges that we have. The open data, it's really like a really low challenge, which we have to convince people and incentivize people. But in these committees, it's about who will get the chair in my department, and I want to have a say in this, and not work with somebody who I think is only who's only judged not on the merit of his research, but only on the like how he's doing research. And these are really really difficult. It's very, very difficult to get this going, and Miriam can't sit on every committee because there are like 100 to 150 professors appointed per year at the Charité, and but she tries her best to select certain committees, and she's also trying to get an overview, because in some committees this works very, very well, and in some committees it doesn't, and we're currently trying to find out why.
Cool. Any more questions?
No questions here.
So
I guess we can move on then. We'll be happy to hear about this, and then we have a second round of Q&A. Because I guess.
Okay, so so we can go to the DECIDE project, and it's called the DECIDE project, and this is a bit perhaps nearer to what you do in your application project. So, but I thought it's interesting for you to hear about the quest because it's embedded in the quest, and I will be the project leader on this DECIDE project. It's called Decision Enabling Confirmation of Innovative Discoveries and Exploratory Evidence. You have to know German funders really like acronyms. You even have to give one in your application. Don't ask why. That's the German way to do this. Okay, so the DECIDE project, what we basically do is we have 10 to 20, we don't know yet. The selection process has not ended and we're not part of the selection process. 10 to 20 preclinical research projects. That is, people have an initial finding, either published or unpublished. And what they have to do is they want to confirm this finding to come to a decision, should I bring this to the clinic or not? And this is of course the holy grail of translation. How can we find evidence to decide to bring something into the clinic? How can we decide whether a result is really holding up to the test? And in preclinical research, it's not so easy, because it may hold in animals, but it may not hold in humans. So can we find markers for this as well? So it's this whole really complicated preclinical world where we're currently trying to, because Uli has a lot of experience in this, but we're trying to, now our mission is, we have a project manager, we have a postdoc, and we have a PhD student, so 3 persons plus me working on this project to educate the 10 to 20 projects that are selected, and also to evaluate how they're doing and to evaluate what kind of practices they implement will work and will not work towards confirming a result or refuting the confirmation. This is also possible, of course. And what I want to present you now is work from a, oh yeah, there's an additional PhD student who has already started, and I'm going to present you some of the work that she did, because this is kind of guiding our agenda towards how we will counsel these projects. It would be interesting to get your feedback on this. So I already talked about the translational gap. So there's a gap between preclinical and clinical research. This is a figure from Nature, an old Nature paper, but it's known for a long time that there's this translational gap. And how can we bridge this? And I show you here, for example, this is in stroke models in preclinical research. This is here on the left-hand side, you find the intervention that were tested in mice. And you see that there's a total of 20,000 animals tested, and we see that there's a general effect size in the primary outcome variable, that is in stroke, the reduction of infarct volume when you lesion mice, and you see there's a 30% reduction in infarct volume. So apparently this is good news. This is good news from the preclinic, and this is a 2010 paper. And here you see in a 2014 paper, you don't have to read everything, but here on the left-hand side, you can have the treatments. And the thing is here on the right-hand side, you have the results from the clinical trials. And it's really disheartening. It's neutral, neutral, negative, neutral, neutral, and only one is positive, this NXY059. It's, and this is where we're coming from. This is also where my boss Uli is coming from. It's this translational gap that's so interesting. And if we look at all the preclinical data that has been collected, a critical appraisal of this would have not led to clinical trials. And the question is, why were those clinical trials started in the first place? And can we find a better way to come to good evidence in clinical trials? And how is replication aiding us in this? And so the basic question is how to generate evidence for informed decisions to engage in clinical trials. And since we're all on limited budget, even in biomedical sciences, how to create value. And this is one of the things that the Quest wants to do, create value. How to create value with, for example, 1 million rodents. And we use in the primary approach, we use a simulation approach. So we don't have any data in yet, but we use a simulation approach to look at these processes. How will a lab do a replication, and what are kind of good ways to do a replication and decide for a replication, and what are kind of non-optimal ways. And we use this 1 million rodents. This is approximately the number of rodents used in Berlin within 5 years. Also for breeding and other purposes, but it's just to illustrate how many rodents there are, and this is the number that we use up in 5 years in Berlin. So how can we use them efficiently to create value? That is, how can we use them to collect evidence for our decision to engage in a clinical trial? And we make some assumptions, and I don't know whether you're familiar with John Ioannidis' paper on the positive predictive value, but one of the core core assumptions also in his paper is that if we're doing science, not everything that we test, not all our hypotheses will turn out to be true. And if we say 90% of our hypotheses will turn out true, well, this would be boring. We'd not engage into science because this is just a boring enterprise. Everything will be true. But as we can see also from science, this is not the case. So we can think some assumptions is, one of the assumptions that we have is that not all of our effects are true. So for example, in this example here, which I'll relate to, we are not further than this example. We're currently running more simulations on different examples. But in these examples, if you look at the true effect size that we're testing in a certain paradigm, we see in this example, for example, that 13% of the effects are above 0.3. We see a distribution of effects. Yeah, so many effects are near zero. And this comes from a notion of Andy Gellman. He's a professor, statistics professor at Columbia University. And he says there's never a zero effect. So this null hypothesis testing is basically irrelevant because we're always testing some effect. There will be some effect, but the important bit will be what is the distribution of effects. And for now, we are assuming that we have a certain distribution of effects, and this distribution may look differently. We're currently testing for this if this distribution looks differently, but for now, for this example that I'm going to show you very early on, we're assuming that 17% of the effects are above 0.3. So why 0.3? If we look at the efficacy of a certain drug, if we have in clinical trials an efficacy of 0.3, this means that compared to some kind of standard, we need to treat 10 patients to receive 1 patient more that will be healed. So this is already an effect that in clinical trials is considered worthwhile doing. Everything below this is kind of in clinical trials. It depends a bit on the conditions, whether you compare it to gold standard or real control. So doing nothing, but this is kind of in clinical trials considered an effect that might be interesting. And we, as I can tell you, we're also doing additional simulations currently that is deviating from this to test for the robustness of this assumption. So this is one of the assumptions that we have. So that we are conducting science in a world where we have a distribution of effect sizes. And this is more not looking at a single experiment, but it's more looking at a systematic approach. We are having a system of science where a lot of scientists will do experiments, and they are now in a world where we have 17% of the effect sizes above 0.3. Okay, and how is our simulation working? So we have an initial experiment. So it's a very simple simulation. We have an initial experiment, and we know from a lot of the literature that the average effect size is approximately 8 to 12 animals per group in preclinical studies. So we assume now for the simplicity that it's 10 animals per group in an initial experiment. And now the researcher has to go on and decide whether they want to continue. And we devised a couple of ways how they can decide this. So the typical way is how people will decide this is the significance test for p smaller 0.05. But we know from clinical trials that you can also use something that we call an equivalence test, where the effect size is approximately 0.3, as we've seen before. And an equivalence test tests for the possibility that the effect that we see in a certain trial equals 0.3 or more. And if there's the possibility, so the confidence interval, for example, the 80% confidence interval involves 0.3, there's the possibility that this is an effect that may be occurring in our population. And since we only have 10 animals per group, we continue if this equivalence test. So it's an alternative to the significance test, which is very frequently used in clinical trials. So we use this as an alternative to the standard approach to do a significance test of p smaller 0.05. And the next thing that we have to think about, and that's also what you, I think about, is what kind of is the sample size that we will use due to multi-lab replications. We are currently only looking at within lab replications, and we'll extend this to multi-lab in the future. But to understand the system, we first have to go to the within lab. And within lab, we now think that the researcher now has to do a sample size calculation for the confirmation or replication study. So they've done an initial experiment. They have some kind of criterion to carry on, and then they do a within lab replication. And from our interviews with our preclinical researchers, we see that this is kind of the chain that we can expect currently happening in the lab of preclinical research. And then we test a couple of strategies that researchers use currently to calculate the new effect size. And number 2 here, the effect size from initial experiment, this is basically what researchers do currently. So they take the effect size from this initial experiment and use it for the follow-up study. And we all know that there are definitely problems with this approach, but we include it because this is the status quo. This is the status quo, how people will do it. The status quo is they use the significance test as the decision to continue and then calculate the effect size from the initial experiment. An alternative suggested from psychology is a so-called safeguard power analysis, where you take the initial effect size and take the lower bound of the 80% confidence interval to calculate your new sample size. And we propose that there could be even a third one. Since we're already dealing with a minimum effect size of interest, we could take this minimum effect size of interest, 0.3, and calculate our power from this. So we have a couple of approaches. So we have 2 decision criteria to move on and 3 kind of sample size calculations. And if you do this, you might be interested in primary outcome variables. So you're interested in the second stage. So if you finished your replication, what is kind of the sensitivity of your test and the specificity of your test. So you want to know the true positive rate and the true negative rate. And not very surprisingly, but in this when you run these simulations, it's not very surprising, but the magnitude of the effect is very surprising that I'm showing you. So for the equivalence test, so you're taking a more liberal approach. You only have, if you have 1 million animals and you're using 1 million animals, because you're kind of constrained, you have a budget constraint. So you cannot use an infinite number, but we say, okay, you have 1 million animals. So what are you going to do with this? So your budget so you have a certain budget constraint. So, and with the equivalence test, we see that you can only do 10,000 experiments. And of these 10,000 experiments, where you start, and I can quickly go back, you start with the with 20 animals initially, and then you do a sample size calculation in the next stage. And from this, the total number of animals per experiment is calculated. And we can see that with the equivalence test, we can do less experiments than with the significance test, because 65.4% continue to stage number 2. So it's less experiments that we can do with the equivalence test because we're more lenient. This is kind of logically. This is kind of a logically follows from that we're more lenient with our experiments in the equivalence. And with the significance test, so this is how it's done currently, we can conduct a lot of experiments, even test more hypotheses, but only 6% continue to the stage 2, where we do in the confirmation. So less experiments follow. And the question now is, what is good for science, like in this, not for the individual researcher, but in advancing our knowledge, and the sensitivity and the specificity of this test play a major role in this. And if we test this, we can see that, for example, here in the upper panel, you see the sensitivity, that if you do an equivalence test, the sensitivity and the specificity of the test, when you do this equivalence testing, is a lot better. You do less experiments, but the outcome of these experiments is a lot better for the sensitivity and specificity. And the significance test is not so good. So the significance test is very, very conservative in letting these things through. And if we ask ourselves, in what kind of world do we live with our science, we may want to have different strategies selecting between, for example, the equivalence and the significance test to let this through. If we're in Alzheimer's research, where we know that there is no drug currently, and we've overlooked it for 40 years, the probability to detect a drug is very, very low. So we don't want to miss out on a drug. So in this case, this equivalence test will yield more tests of more drugs in more detail, so that we don't miss a drug that we may discard in this significance test. In other fields, where we, for example, have a lot of true hypotheses, the significance test may be a better alternative, because we don't test so many hypotheses, but we only test those hypotheses where the effect size are large. And if we're in a world where we can expect a lot of large effect sizes, the significance test may be the better alternative. And we tested also a couple of power analyses, as I said, safeguard, standard power analysis, and smallest effect size of interest. And there's not too much difference between the three. Some difference, so there may be an optimal way to do this. But if you have what the preliminary results show, if you're living in a world where your hypotheses are very, very unlikely, you should not do a significance test to weed out experiments. But you should rather rely on the significance test in scenarios where it's very, very likely that your hypothesis is true, or rather likely. So what we advocate is not abandoning significance testing in this first stage, but rather be more flexible towards what do we think, which kind of field we're coming from in preclinical research, and then find a good strategy to design our replication attempts. Because the replication attempts here with this equivalence testing, because the second stage takes up a lot of animals. Yeah, so the first stage only takes up 20 animals, and we've also tested if there's no first stage, there's no advantage to this. It's disadvantageous not to have the first stage. And but this first stage will weed out several alternative hypotheses and not let everything continue to the second stage, and this is very important. And researchers will need to decide in what kind of world they're living in. I think immunology, for example, is more on this significance side, whereas neurodegenerative diseases is more on this side. So sample size calculations for replication should be entirely different, depending on the field where your research is done and how you estimate the prior probability of your hypothesis being true. And you can also, what we're currently doing is a lot of further steps. We're currently doing one-sided tests in the second stage. We are also including sequential designs so that you can abandon your trial or quit your trial for futility earlier. This is giving some advantage. We're testing additional effect size distributions for robustness. We're introducing multi-lab replications at a later point in time. We also think about triangulation. So most of the time, people not only do one experiment, but several experiments. And we're beginning to realize that if a Nature paper with 10 animals per group, and they report 6 experiments, and all of them are significant, we can even calculate how likely this is, and they can tell you this is very, very unlikely. It's more likely to win in a lottery, even if the effect size is true. And then we have to consider toxicity versus efficacy trials. So in preclinical trials, you have to distinguish between the two, because toxicity is tested whether this is toxic to humans, and the efficacy is looking at whether this is really helpful. And we're undecided yet whether there should be a big difference between the two, or whether this decision to continue with the clinical trial should rather rest on the toxicity than the efficacy, because the translatability of some animal models is not so good. And now we're testing this on the 20 projects, and we'll see what comes out of it. They don't know yet, but they're a bit of guinea pigs for us, but hopefully they'll see that this makes sense. Okay, and with that, I have to thank, I have to thank my PhD student, Maggie, and Uli Diernagel for contributing to the thoughts in this, and then I'm happy to take questions. But this is only preliminary data, just to showcase what we're currently trying to do. Okay,
so do we have questions? Well, I do have a question. So how are you selecting the projects? I mean, does any effect go? Does this go to a particular area? I mean, what kind of experiment? It looks huge. What kind
so we're not in the selection process. So the selection process is done by the German Science Ministry, because they give approximately 1 million to each project, and it's not up to us to decide. They just selected us to evaluate and educate and do all the other things and come up at the end with a good practice for confirmatory research. But the selection process is up to a review board out of, I think, 10 international reviewers.
But does that go for any kind of, it doesn't focus on any particular areas, anything that is preclinical?
Yeah, anything that is preclinical. So there will be different areas, and this will also be hard to reconcile, of course, because our assumption here is that there will be different strategies for different areas. And if we only have like 2 or 3 experiments from one area, this will limit our sample size, of course, to test this on the project. So the tests on the projects will, in this initial phase, be very preliminary and very descriptive. But we already have confirmation from the German Science Ministry that if this is a success, they want to do another call where they not only have 10, but like 50 to 100 projects.
Wow. And each one gets €1 million, is that euro?
Yeah, I guess so.
That's like more. That's like 4 times more than our project, like the whole thing. But yeah, that's
yes, yeah. But you have to understand that the clinical trial is very, very expensive.
Yeah. Oh, that
the clinical trial costs like 50 times, 100 times more than this.
Yeah. Oh, so that includes the clinical trials. Okay, yeah. So
no. The $1 million does not include the clinical trials. It's only the preclinical trials. And
okay.
the $1 million is what we currently estimate it might take. Perhaps there are projects that will only take up 300,000 euros. We don't know yet how generous the German Science Ministry will be, but we hope at least our project is funded with approximately 1.2 million. So we hope that the other projects will be funded in a similar vein.
So that is, and that money is managed by the lab that has the original finding, or is that managed like centrally?
Yes,
and you
exactly. Yes, no. This is managed by the lab who receives the funding from the German Science Ministry, but they have to agree that we will oversee some of their decisions, like we as the Quest. Not all of them, of course. It's still academic freedom and everything, but they'll have to give us the data and they have to give us access to certain things. So this will all be still negotiated, but it's pretty clear that we'll get access to a lot of this data.
And do you have some kind of like testing standards at the moment, like how many labs you should be replicating in or whatever, or is that still?
No, not yet. No, so we hope that we get a good estimate from this when we see the proposals. So I've secretly seen 2 of them. One of them had only 1 additional lab, and I hope that more of them will have multiple labs, so that we also can get an estimate for the between lab variance. So this is one of the things that we're currently testing in another project. Perhaps I already told you about this. So Maggie, my PhD student, she's currently testing for the between lab variance and also between experimental variants in existing data sets. So that's these are sets that are already acquired by behavioral phenotyping labs. This is one in Munich and one in Berlin, and we try to well, we already have the data, and now we're pre-registering this.
Interesting. Yeah. And what's your time course for the whole thing? I mean,
oh, it's 4 years.
4 years, yeah.
Yeah, it's 4 years. So the preclinical research projects will run for 3 years, and we will run for 4 years. So we start half a year earlier and end half a year later.
I see. And is there some? I mean, you mentioned futility analysis at some point. I do think that, like,
yeah,
I would guess that a lot of things just like turn out not to be true early. That like depending on how things go. I mean, what happens if if on the 2nd or 3rd stage of confirmation, okay, this is gone already. I mean, does it go on forever? Or?
So every project is required a pre-registration by the German Science Ministry. So they have to pre-register it and have to publish their results. So this is mandatory. So this can happen, but they have to publish it anyways.
Yes. No, but just, I mean, is there like a stopping early kind of rule? Because I mean, sometimes like the first time.
Yeah, so what we want to advocate to them is to do a sequential design in their follow-up study, and we don't know whether they will follow this or not. So there are a couple of studies where they have low number of animals still, because it's large-scale animals. So if you use sheep, you cannot do like 100 animals. And in this case, we won't advocate this. But in cases where they have enough animals in their follow-up study, in their replication, like 100 animals, we will advocate that use sequential designs. And with these simulations, we will also explore when sequential designs make a difference and how much. So we have already some results on the number of animals needed. But of course, we want people to stop for futility, just because we have these 3R concerns and everything else. So this will be very important also in this course, to see how sequential designs can they be implemented, how will they be implemented, and how many interim analyses do we need. And all these things will come apparent, I think, in the first half year of the projects. Because we have to apply for regulatory bodies as well. So it's slightly more complicated, I guess, than in Brazil, but every project needs to still apply to the regulatory bodies for the animal experimental permit. And this experimental animal permit is not easy to obtain, particularly in replication studies. So we have to do a lot of convincing work and policy work here as well in Germany, because a lot of people are convinced that replications are not worthwhile and that they're unethical.
Yeah, we have the same problem. Everything has to go still through animal regulation.
Yeah, okay.
We have reached out for like the National Animal Regulation Institution, and they have given like a general statement that we think replication is important and it's worth doing. That said, I mean, like each experiment has to go through the local institution, so it's going to be a lot of work in terms of.
But we only have federal institutions, so there are like 15 in Germany, so we have to convince them all.
Yeah. So more questions?
No questions here, Olavo.
Gleb and Maddie, what is it? Who else is there? Well, if you have questions for us, I mean, it's I guess that's allowed as well. I mean, we're.
Yeah. So I'm interested. How is your project going? I mean, you told me a bit about the World Conference for Research Integrity, and it would be very, very interesting also to learn for us from your experiences, and perhaps if Clarissa, if you're at the Reward Conference. How long will you be in Berlin, and would it be possible for you to give a talk also at our institute?
Sure, I will be actually in Austria for 3 months, so it should be easier to go to Berlin anytime between December and March. So I haven't exactly planned around the Reward Conference, but I'll be happy to adjust.
Yeah, that would be great. It would be, so we have a seminar. We have money to invite you, so it would be great if you could come and give a talk.
Thank you. That would be
at our
great.
institute. Yeah, we have this meta research colloquium, and you would be a perfect fit for this. So I'll forward write me an email, and I'll forward the name to Maggie, who's coordinating this. Yeah, and just tell me when you're there, and then we can invite you from Austria, and you tell us everything about the reproducibility project and what you're doing over there, and it would be super interesting for us.
Thank you. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, definitely a lot has happened since May. I mean, we got to the part where we actually like need the input from all the labs, and that has turned out to be kind of slow because people respond in like very different speeds, and like it's very hard to get like 65 people to adhere to deadlines. But we're we're kind of learning the way, though. I mean, it's just and people have very good reasons to miss deadlines sometimes. I mean, it's like there are all kinds of things happen, so it's very hard to like keep everybody on the same schedule, and you kind of have to give flexibility. But I think it's different from your project in the sense like we're running a lot of we're pretty centralized. So and we're trying to like keep everybody running together, but of course it's hard. But we're getting to the point of like registering protocols, buying stuff, and submitting to animal to animal permits. Hopefully we'll have that done by the end of the year. I don't think any experiments will happen this year. Well, maybe like 1 or 2 that have like nothing to buy, but that should be the exception. Mostly, I think things should start very early next year. But so we're kind of like 6 months behind the schedule we originally thought about. But yeah, that's
but this is
how it goes. Yes. But I think we're doing okay. I think the prediction market should be fun. We should be starting that.
Is Anna Dreber running this?
Yes, the Anna Dreber and Yilin Chen and us and some other people in Brazil. Yeah. But yeah, it's just pretty much it should follow more or less the same design that they use for the projects. And it's interesting to see because I mean I guess this is it could be very different. I mean, psychology experiments have this common sense thing to it that you can like have an insight of does this look likely or not, which I think is much harder in biology. That said, we're opening up for like anybody who has experience in experimental research in any area. So I mean, there might be information just like seeing the effect sizes and p-values and whatever. Maybe if you might not know anything about PCRs and still get some stuff right. We're also adding an extra comparison, which is each participant gets to predict 20 experiments. You choose one of the 3 methods, and but you get like 10 with just the result, and then the other one with the full article, including the authors, the journal, the venue, whatever. Yeah. So we're going to see if that makes a difference, and I think that's a good question as well. Especially in Brazil, like the community is not it's big enough, but I mean, a lot of people like know the authors or know the institution or know the journal. Yeah. Like I guess there's all kinds of things like people factor in when they have a full paper rather than like a single result.
Yeah, they have prior expectations. Yes.
Yeah, so I guess that's. I mean, even before the results are in, just to see like how people bet differently depending on the information is also interesting. But of course, like the experiments will end by late next year or like early 2021. So it's still like a long time until we actually get to see the prediction results.
Yeah.
But I'll send you the email if you can like circulate around. We're open to anybody.
Yes. I can circulate this also on our Twitter account and
yes.
Yeah.
That definitely helps.
I can do this.
Like
I can do this, and hopefully. Yeah, and hopefully Clarissa can come over, even not only for the reward conference, but also for giving a talk. This will also be very, very nice. Yes. And we'd really appreciate this.
Good. Anybody else?
No.
Nope. So I guess we're ready to wrap up. It's 5.
Okay.
Yeah,
very good.
It's not. We're interested to hear like how the project. So when we have the experiment selected?
Yeah, I think it will be. We start 1st of February, so I guess it will be like end of January, mid-February, hopefully, if the reviewers keep the timeline, and then we can perhaps exchange again ideas. And if Clarissa is there, I can also tell her what is going on, and at least at the reward conference we should know.
Definitely, yes. And is that going to be open, or are the actual projects like top secret or something?
Yeah, I think I cannot share the exact protocols, but I can give you at least an overview, I guess. And by 1st of February, we'll also have the team assembled. So as I said, we have 2 postdocs and a PhD student. The PhD student will join slightly later, but we have 2 postdocs working on this, and I'll also set you into contact with them. So we have 1 selected already, and the other one is currently, we're in the process of hiring somebody. So if Clarissa is there, hopefully this will already be finished, and I can tell you who this is, and you can also get into contact with them, and they can share information and everything else. So
let us know if you can help in any way, right? I mean, in terms of
exactly.
experience and
Yeah, exactly. Hopefully we can do this. And I think it will be interesting because your question is slightly different from our questions, but I think we can still learn from how these replications are done and what we can learn, particularly from your project, what is the between lab variance. And this will be interesting also for my PhD student who is currently working on this in behavioral phenotyping. Between lab variance, how is this influencing results? What kind of standards can we expect from very simple behavioral paradigms like the open field or elevated plasmase? And as you said, you're still doing the elevated plasmase.
Yes, we have 20 experience with that.
Yeah, so we asked for data, particularly of the elevated plasmase. Since you're doing this, we try to get data, historical data from these behavioral phenotyping, from controls from the behavioral phenotyping groups to see with between lab variants for a particular mouse strain for this particular test, only in the controls, to just assess how is the variance distributed.
Where did you get the data from? From a specific?
So it's called the Animal Outcome Core facility in Berlin. So this is a large-scale phenotyping facility. I don't know whether they have a lot of elevated plasmase. They have a lot of open field experiments, like 300 or something. And we compare this with the German mouse clinic, which is in Munich, and they apparently have even more data.
Interesting.
Yeah. And they both agreed now, finally, to let us have a look at the data, and we are looking only at controls because this is giving us a good estimate, at least for the within lab and between lab variants, and we can also compare means between controls between certain mouse strains that they have. So we're also looking at strains, we're looking at experimental experience if we can get it, and we're looking at between lab variants.
Yeah, no, I think those are great questions, really.
Yeah. Yeah, this is like another project that we're currently running, but which will nicely complement, I think, this DECIDE project, which is a bit more large scale.
Good. Well,
okay.
Thank you very much. And
hey, so cool talking to you, and hopefully we get we all get really nice results, and then we meet at some time and push them all together and compare them and have a really nice meeting. And Clarissa, already looking forward to meet you here in Berlin.
Yeah, definitely. I'll pass by Europe in September. Actually, I'll be in Cambridge for some meeting.
Okay.
This year.
Yeah.
So
just tell us, and we can invite you over or whatever from Cambridge, and we'd be happy also to host you.
Still a long way down, but yeah, we can maybe that would be.
Yeah. Just keep us updated, and we have this seminar, and we are happy to invite you. That will be no problem.
Cool. Well,
yeah. Thank you.
Hey.
See you around.
Olavo, Clarissa, Juliana, thank you very much, and hopefully see you around.
Cool.
Yeah.
Bye.
Okay. Hey, cheers.
Bye. Bom, gente, quem está aí, tchau, obrigado pela audiência e